Dear colleagues, as we unfortunately had to cancel this year's World Congress in Montreal, we thought it would be a good idea to at least share some highlights from the virtual Congress that took place in February. Before the video starts, I would like to announce that the 2022 World Congress in Taipei, Taiwan will take place from June 9th to the 12th. I look forward to seeing you there in person, and now please enjoy the video. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel below for free so you can watch more videos in the next weeks. Thank you.
Thank you, John. So it's a pleasure to be here and participate in this, and particularly with such an able and interesting colleague as Kostas. So if I can get my screen to move. Oops. There we go. So I'm not an anti-pharma person. Now, you can see that I've received honoraria for lectures from various companies, and indeed very difficult for any of us to be against pharmaceutical companies in this age, that the pharma companies with their development of the vaccines, I think, are saving our world economy. So I'm not naturally disposed to attack pharmaceutical companies. But what I would like to say is that I think we should, be more cautious about the long-term prophylactic use of antipsychotics. I totally accept that antipsychotics are the appropriate, or one of the appropriate treatments for the initial care of people who are acutely psychotic or who are having relapses. And also for people who are having continued symptoms, if their symptoms are helped and improved by antipsychotics. But what I'm concerned about is the prophylactic use. So these are people where they have their positive psychotic symptoms have disappeared, but we say to them, you should keep taking the antipsychotic because it may prevent, or it will prevent, the return of your symptoms. So that's the group that I think the debate is about. And I would suggest that, as well as thinking what can we do to decrease positive symptoms, we have to think what are the downsides of antipsychotics. And we of course we know that, as with all drugs, there are lots of side effects, but in recent years particularly, we've been concerned about the risk to physical health. We've been concerned about the effect of brain structure and brain function. Then there's the question of what proportion of patients benefit from antipsychotics in the long term and what proportion can come off antipsychotics. And does long-term use of antipsychotics induce treatment resistance in some patients? So these are the main things that I will cover. So there is a question, of course, not only about the obesity, but does it actually contribute to higher mortality in people with psychosis? And many studies have suggested that it might. But over the last 8 or 9 years, there's been some very influential studies coming out of Finland, particularly Dr. Tihonen's group, Finland and to some extent Sweden. And this is a typical study. This shows the mortality in a huge proportion of patients followed up, 21,000 schizophrenia patients followed up. And what is their risk of death? And you can see that the highest risk is in those who had no antipsychotics. Then the best is those who had low antipsychotic exposure, and then moderate antipsychotic exposure, and then high antipsychotic exposure. So high antipsychotic exposure is not good for your increases your risk of death, but so does no antipsychotic. So this seemed to be quite persuasive, and indeed the pharmaceutical companies have been very enthusiastic about this series of papers. But there's been a lot of criticisms, and there's actually a debate. There's been a debate going on in psychological medicine, which I'm one of the editors, and Robert Whittaker, who's not a doctor actually, but he's a rather campaigning journalist who is actually the founder of Mad in America. And he has wrote an article on this question: do antipsychotics really protect against early death? And said that the studies are plagued with methodological and reporting issues. The group that took no antipsychotics are older, and the group that took no antipsychotics is very likely to have preferentially included homeless and drug abusers and people who are unlikely to have looked after them. So this provoked a response from Dr. Tehan and Carell, and then various other colleagues muscled in. But I think some of the criticisms of Whittaker still stand. Can some patients remain well without antipsychotics? Well, we've carried out a study of a follow-up study of about 400 people with their first episode of psychosis, and we followed them up to 10 years. And after 10 years, 40% of those with a diagnosis of schizophrenia had had no psychotic symptoms for more than 2 years. We were quite pleased with this, particularly as this is in our area, particularly it's an inner city area. But of course, some of these patients may have been on antipsychotics. Yes, half of them were still on antipsychotics, but 19% of people with schizophrenia had no psychotic symptoms at 10 years, hadn't had them for 2 years, and they weren't taking any antipsychotics. So I think it shows that all people who get a diagnosis of schizophrenia do not need to take antipsychotics for life. And there have been 3 other long-term studies which have come to similar conclusions. About 20% of people get a diagnosis of schizophrenia can come off antipsychotics and remain well. So in some patients, we compound a presynaptic disorder with an iatrogenic postsynaptic this abnormality. What are the consequences? Well, all placebo-controlled trials of people who are already had antipsychotics are invalidated. And there's the question of, does antipsychotic withdrawal provoke psychosis? And the literature is still out on this. But I wanted just to touch on the question of how we reduce antipsychotics. The important thing in reducing antipsychotics is the D2 occupancy level. And if you decrease risperidone from 4 milligrams to 3 milligrams, the occupancy level just goes down from about 75% to about 68%. You go to 2 milligrams, it's still pretty high. It's when you get low that it begins to plummet. You go from 1 milligram to 0, then you go from 40% to 0. So it's a huge drop in the D2 occupancy. And that's the point at which I think you can get relapse. Much better to go very slow when you get to 1 milligram or even 2 milligrams, going to 1.75, 1.5, 1.75, 0.5, 0.25, and so on. And I think this is much less likely to result in people relapsing. And so this should be done very slowly over many months, and in some cases over several years. So the final point I wanted to make is that perhaps this supersensitivity can cause antipsychotic treatment to fail. The more you give antipsychotics, the more you cause supersensitivity, the less effective may be the antipsychotic. So I'll skip this last 2 slides and conclude that I'm very lucky that I have a mentor because of my name. Robin, you know, is looked after by Batman. And in such difficult circumstances, I say, what should I do, Batman? And the answer is, be more cautious, Robin. So thank you for listening.